covering 4 main tracks regrouped by specific sub-themes and the language of presentation. So there are 7 sessions in Arabic and 10 in English. يسعدني في هذه الكلمة الافتتاحية الترحيب برئيس مجلس الأمناء الدكتور عزمي بشارة، وبرئيس معهد الدوحة الدكتور عبد الوهاب الأفندي، وبرئيس الرابطة وعميد كلية الإدارة العامة واقتصاديات التنمية الدكتور حامد علي، وبضيوفنا الأعزاء. وأتقدم بالشكر لجميع المشاركين ورؤساء الجلسات والمساعدين. I would like to thank the keynote speakers, Professor Leslie Paul and Dr. Stephen Hertog, and all participants, panelists, and session chairs from DI and from the Arab Center, and all assistants. Without further ado, I leave the mic to Dr. Hamid Ali. So Dr. Hamid Ali, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نرحب بكم في معهد الدوحة للدراسات العليا في فعاليات المؤتمر العالمي التاسع للسياسات العامة والإدارة العامة في الشرق الأوسط. ونشكر بالنيابة عن كلية الإدارة العامة واقتصاديات التنمية الدكتور عزمي بشارة رئيس مجلس الأمناء، والدكتور عبد الوهاب الأفندي رئيس المعهد الدوحة للدراسات العليا بالوكالة على دعمهم المستمر. وأيضا الشكر موصول للجنة التحضيرية واللجنة التنظيمية للمؤتمر وكادر الكلية الذين عملوا دون ملل على إيصال المؤتمر على ما هو عليه اليوم، وخاصة الدكتورة ربيع نجيب، وأيضا من الموظفين الأستاذ محمد العتر وفريقه. إننا في رابطة السياسات العامة والإدارة العامة في الشرق الأوسط نسعى إلى تعزيز قيم السلام والازدهار والحكم الرشيد في الشرق الأوسط، وتلتزم الرابطة التي تضم أكثر من 600 عضوا حول العالم بمبادئ تطوير الشراكات المحلية والإقليمية والدولية التي تدعم أنشطة الخدمة العامة والسياسات العامة في الشرق الأوسط. وتنمو الرابطة باضطراد، يعمل أعضاؤها بصورة جماعية ويتشاركون المسؤولية بكفاءة، الأمر الذي يضمن الديناميكية والنزاهة والقدرة على تمتين البنية المنظمة وتحويلها إلى مؤسسة علمية فعالة. كما نسعى إلى تخطيط شامل بما يضمن تمتين قواعدنا بالإضافة إلى حشد طاقاتنا ومواردنا وصهرها في أجندة تخدم مستقبل الرابطة وتمكن من مواجهة تحدياتنا واغتنام الفرص الممكنة على أوسع النطاق. ويسعدنا في الرابطة أن نرى مؤسسة التعليم العالي وعلى رأسها معهد الدوحة للدراسات العليا والجامعة الأمريكية في القاهرة، جامعة الكويت، جامعة الأخوين في سباق وتنافس لرعاية أنشطة مؤتمر أميبا. وإن دل على شيء فإنما يدل على مكانة الرابطة لدى مؤسساتنا الفعالة والرغبة للاستجابة للتحديات، خصوصا وأن جائحة كورونا كوفيد 19 أثارت سؤالا أساسيا حول إعادة النظر في دور الدولة وطبيعة السياسات العامة التي سيتم تداولها سعيا لتقديم إجابات مقنعة. لقد أكملت المؤتمر إلى قبول 67 ورقة بحثية وفق معايير أكاديمية وعلمية عالية، ويسعدنا مشاركة أكاديميين من 47 مؤسسة تعليمية من 20 دولة لتقديم دراسات عميقة. وهنا لابد أن أذكر عن كلية الإدارة العامة واقتصاديات التنمية، كلية لديها إمكانيات وموارد تمكنها من أن تكون رائدة في المجال السياسات العامة في العالم العربي. وإننا في كلية الإدارة العامة واقتصاديات التنمية بفضل الجهد الجماعي نسعى لتقديم البحث الذي يلامس الاحتياجات الملحة لمجتمعنا والتي تشمل قضايا العدالة الاجتماعية والاقتصادية ودور الدولة في صنع السياسات العامة، فإننا نتوجه بالشكر لشركائنا الحاليين والمستقبليين، وعلى رأسهم شراكتنا مع كلية الآداب والعلوم بجامعة قطر المتمثلة بالدكتور إبراهيم الدين العميد الدكتور إبراهيم الكعبي، حيث وقعنا معهم مذكرات للتفاهم والتعاون البحثي، وأيضا كلية السياسات العامة في جامعة حمد خليفة المتوسلة بدكتور ليزلي بول العميد المؤسس الذي يقدم ورقة اليوم. ونؤمن في كلية الإدارة العامة واقتصاديات التنمية أن التوسع ضروري لضمان مستقبل أكاديمي رفيع، وعليه فإن حصولنا على الاعتماد من هيئة ناسب الدولية لبرنامج السياسات العامة هو الحجر الأساس للاعتماد للبرامج الأخرى في الكلية. وقريبا سنزف إليكم خبر اعتماد برامج أخرى إضافية وفق المعايير الدولية التي يضمنها معهد الدوحة للدراسات العليا. ونشكركم على حضوركم وتفاعلكم، ونتطلع إلى مشاركة بحثية قيمة. الجزء الثاني عشان لأنه الضيوف بتاعتنا كلهم بالأجانب من الخارج، الجزء باللغة الإنجليزية. Welcome to Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, the 9th conference. I'm putting two hats today here as the President of Middle Eastern and Public Policy Administration and as the Dean of Public Policy and Administration. AMEPA is a scholarly professional network dedicated to advancing peace and prosperity and good governance in the Middle East. Let me thank my colleagues at the American University in Cairo for hosting and supporting AMEPA for years. Also, on the behalf of the School of Public Administration and Development Economics, I would like to thank Dr. Abdul Wahab Al-Afendi, the acting president of the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, and also the chair of the Board of Trustees, Dr. Azmi Bishara, for their support. In addition, I would like to thank the preparatory committee of organizing the conference and their effort and relentless support, and especially thanks to Dr. Rabia Najib and Muhammad Al-Itr and his crew, and Muhib and Rabia and Rabab, and also for our support staff from the AUC, Ahmed Juma and Inas Abdul Azim. AMEPA is committed to developing a local, regional, and global network advancing public services activities within the Middle East. The association has more than 600 members worldwide. As we are steadily growing, we share responsibility, building on the efforts of our colleagues, and we are bringing growth and energy to the organization and help transform it into an effective scholarly institution. Moreover, we are lucky that higher education institutions like Doha Institute, American University in Cairo, Al-Akhwain University are competing in hosting regular activity for AMEPA. Also, we need to plan to empower our organization as well as galvanizing our energy and resources to help set the agenda for the future action to meet our challenges and to seize on the possible opportunities. The AMEPA committee have chosen 67 papers from the academics who belonging to 47 great profile higher education institutions from 20 countries worldwide. As we are moving through a critical time, the COVID-19 triggered a fundamental question on how to revisit the role of the state and the type of public policy to be introduced. We need a collective effort to advance the scholarship that is addressing the pressing need of our society. It includes issues of the social and economic justice, the role of the state post-COVID-19. So to speak, AMEPA is an ideal venue to facilitate dialogue and scholarship. Also, let me here talk about our school of Public Administration and Development Economics. It is a growing school with a very promising potential to be regionally leading a public policy school. It has indeed all the components needed to fulfill its promise. produce and committed, productive and committed faculty with the scholarship potentials and good quality of teaching. This year, we receive accreditation from ANASPA for our public policy program. Next year, we're expecting accreditation for our public administration program and also accreditation from FIVA, hopefully for the economic development program as well. And also we are seeing our impact as our graduates are assuming a leading position in the government and in non-profit sector. As a SPADE, we are pleased to see a partnership with the School of Arts and Science at Qatar University and the School of Public Policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Finally, I would like to thank Dr. Ibrahim Al-Ka'bi, the Dean of College of Arts and Science at the Qatar University, and Liz Lepal, the founding Dean of the School of Public Policy at KBUS, and the sustainable support, collaboration, and support. So looking forward for the rich presentation. Finally, I would like to present Dr. Abdul Wahab Al-Afendi, the DI President and the former Dean of the School of Social Science at DI, and also a former diplomat, and also the political figure in the Sudanese politics as well. And also she was a professor at University of Westminster. So the floor is for you, Dr. Abdul Wahab. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamid. I'm going to reiterate your thanks for the Association of Public Policy Administration in the Middle East and our colleagues here in the Institute who have been working very hard to host this event here. I think we are very grateful and we are gratified that AMEPA has chosen this, our institute this year for its ninth global conference. I believe this is in recognition of the role we are trying to play as an institute in contributing to knowledge production and to improvement and highlighting learning in the social sciences and humanities. I believe that the professional and academic associations also play an important role, not less than what the universities and institutes like ours play. The sciences generally in the modern world has been advanced first by association, from the Royal Society to other Académie Française and other institutions which had been set up before some of the universities, and they have then given a definition to the disciplines. So there is an important contribution to be played by associations. For example, a lot of people in our discipline, political science, date the appearance of political science as a discipline from the establishing of APSA, the American Political Science Association, in 1904, because usually when there are enough, of course, before that, people date the establishing of chairs in certain disciplines in the universities as maybe the start, but usually a discipline becomes a reality after there is enough a critical mass of experts who will then form a society or an association. Now, these associations define what the discipline is, they debate about it, they advance it, they recognize sub-disciplines in it, they debate its methodologies, its character, its field, and so they are universities and other institutions. Of course, they contribute through their research, but this research is usually tested within the association. So We are also then gratified also that there is now a Middle East chapter of AMEPA, and that it is now maturing. It is contributing to the evolution and development of the discipline. And this is also why we in the Institute also join them in this endeavor, because we are trying to make the Middle East and make the Arab world a place where it's not a backwater for knowledge, where we receive only publications which come from the Western and America and other areas as consumers. We think it is now time for our region to be a leading player and sit at the table, at the high table with everybody else, with the leaders in the discipline. The Doha Institute has been contributing to this, have been in practice as well as in theory, trying to develop this approach. I think when we have organizations like AMEPA, the Middle East, then we'll have a partner we think we will then move ahead with to complete this endeavor. So I welcome you. I welcome you, endeavor. We are very glad. We would have hoped to host you physically here in Doha, and hopefully at a future event we will be able to do that when this crisis is over. And I think the crisis itself has made your discipline and public policy administration at the forefront of concerns. Nowadays, the role of the state has been emphasized, the role of how to run efficient ways of combating the disease, because now the issue of policy has become a matter of life and death, as we see, for example, in the United States today. Because of mismanagement, the country is every day hitting a record in cases, in hospitalization, in the number of deaths. And everybody would think that a better administration, a better policy approach would have actually saved lives. So it's not, what we are engaged in today is not just a matter of academic, as they say, debate, but it is something important for us, for the Middle East, for the Arab world, for the world. Thank you very much. هل تحبوني أقول شيء عربي ولا خلاص that's enough? Hamid?
I think that's enough.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Wahab. Thank you very much, Dr. Hamid Ali. أشكركم على هذه الكلمة الافتتاحية. So now we will move to our guest, our keynote speaker, Dr. Leslie Paul. Okay, just to introduce him briefly, Dr. Leslie Paul is a founding dean of the College of Public Policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University, HBKU, and Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University in Canada, Ottawa. He's the author and co-author or editor of over 30 books, the most recent one are Beyond Policy Analysis, Public Issue Management in Turbulent Times, the 6th edition, which has been released this year, 2020. Global Governance and Muslim Organizations, 2019. Policy Transfer, Microdynamics and Microeffects, that has been published in 2017. And Policy Making in a Transformative State, The Case of Qatar, published in 2016. Dr. Paul has published over 90 articles and book chapters in a wide variety of areas of public policy and administration, information technology, European integration, international human rights, and international public management reform. He has been a visiting professor at several universities, including the Ragnar Nurse Department of Innovation and Governance, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, the University of New South Wales in Australia, the Russian Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, and the Higher School of Economics in Russia. Dr. Paul has served on the editorial boards of many renowned journals and is currently the executive editor of the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis and vice president of the International Public Policy Association. He has served as a consultant to many Canadian government ministries and organizations, as well as to international organizations such as the Swedish International Institute for Public Administration, the Asian Productivity Association, the Hong Kong Civil Service Training and Development Institute, and in the World Bank and the OECD. The talk of Dr. Leslie today is entitled Future Tense, a New Grammar for the Policy Sciences. So from the title, we can see that Dr. Paul is addressing in this talk an extremely timing and pertinent topic. We're all witnessing what we can call a critical juncture right now. BC has been used commonly to refer to a marking period in our history, in our modern history that we are witnessing and experiencing. BC will have a different meaning and connotation. So the word before Corona will definitely not be the same after Corona or COVID. Therefore, many fields need to be revisited. So Dr. Paul is offering an excellent reflection and thought-provoking analysis related to the field of public administration. A brief introduction of his talk. So post-pandemic, there will be a need for new ways to think about and practice public policy, ways that demand more than just renovations in theory, but a new grammar for the field. We may be facing a future tense for the policy sciences. The pandemic seemed to expose a fatal fragility in economic, political, and global institutions that had long been taken for granted. A new syntax for the policy sciences will have to grapple with a new role for the state, changes in policy fields, issues, and debates, and the stress test experienced by our conventional theories. So, Dr. Leslie Paul, the floor is yours. The mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabia. And first, let me extend my thanks for this honor, of course, for appearing as a keynote speaker at this very distinguished conference. Let me extend my congratulations to Dr. Rabia and her colleagues at the Doha Institute for organizing a conference like this under what must have been very difficult circumstances. We know are very difficult circumstances. And of course, my thanks as well to Dr. Hamid, and congratulations to the school, and my final thanks to AMEPA, of course, for providing this opportunity to share some ideas and some thoughts with you. So let's get this going. I think, so can everyone see my slide? I believe so, right?
Yes.
So this is, thank you. This is the title, as Dr. Rabia mentioned, Future Tense, a New Grammar for the Policy Sciences. What I'm going to be talking about basically is drawing from a forthcoming book, the concluding chapter of a forthcoming book. Like many people, we were organizing conferences in 2020, earlier this year, and we had a workshop organized at the college in April of 2020, just around the time, of course, that the lockdowns and restrictions began to take place around this country and around the world. And so the papers were submitted. We actually had papers for the workshop, and then at the very last minute, we had to decide to pull the plug and not be able to go forward. with the workshop, but we had the papers in hand, and so our colleagues very generously agreed to revise their papers and submit their papers for a publication. The interesting exercise in all of this was that it was a conference on the future of the policy sciences, and the papers had been written before COVID really began to take its toll. And so the revisions that were undertaken over the summer were revisions on the future of the policy sciences from the perspective of the pandemic. And so the book is entitled The Future of the Policy Sciences. It's co-edited with my colleague Anis Ben Brick here at the college. It will be coming out in 2021 with Edward Elgar, and it has a number of very distinguished colleagues and contributions. Our concluding chapter is the chapter that I'll be drawing my remarks from, and it tries to summarize and draw together some of the insights, not all of them, but some of the insights from the accumulated chapters in the book. So let me begin first with a couple of fairly typical reactions to the pandemic. The first one is, this changes everything, and that reaction is the notion that after the pandemic, all of our governance and all of our policy and all of our public administration is going to be irrevocably changed. That's a very extreme view, but you see it in various places. The other perspective is, is policy amnesia. And this is where quite the opposite. It's where the possibility that people will want, after the vaccine and after COVID, sometime around March or April this year, never to hear about the pandemic or about COVID or Corona ever again, or for at least a long time, and they'll want to get back to normal and back to life. This is not unprecedented. In the great Spanish flu of 1918, in the decade following the Spanish flu, there was virtually nothing written about it. And some people have ascribed this absence of reflection to this deep-seated desire for amnesia. So I'm going to take a middle road between this changes everything and we want to forget everything. Partly because policy initiatives are sticky. I mean, some of the things that governments have been doing and are doing now will have a stickiness to them, will have a tendency perhaps to remain for a variety of reasons that we could discuss possibly in the question period. But I mean, a nice example is income taxes, which were introduced just before the Second World War, during the Second World War in many Western countries as a temporary policy initiative. And we have seen that has remained sticky, to say the least. So the stickiness of policy initiatives is something to keep in mind. And the second aspect I think that's worth bearing in mind as well is that the pandemic seemed to have amplified some of the pre-existing conditions in bodies politic around the world. Again, it depends on the context and the country, but the absence or weaknesses in public healthcare services, income inequality, racism, social media pathologies, gender inequalities, whether global policymaking institutions are competent or not, the role of China, the quality of democracy, authoritarianism, its rise or fall, trust in experts, digital divides, intergenerational solidarity. These were issues that were, of course, bubbling in policy discourses and debates in different countries around the world. But the pandemic, in some or all of these cases, tended to magnify, intensify, exacerbate, irritate those debates. And I think that will have a lingering quality as well. So I'm going to take a middle road between this changes everything and let's forget everything, and try to anticipate or think about or reflect on some of the ways in which the pandemic will create a new grammar or force a new grammar of policy sciences, new ways of thinking about the issues that lie ahead of us. So I'm going to be touching on 5 different themes in the next few slides. I want to talk about the role of the state, and that's already been touched on by a number of our colleagues. The second aspect is different policy fields. I'll be looking at education and healthcare, just touching on how we can anticipate that these 2 policy fields are going to change and evolve over the coming year or years. Thirdly, I want to consider a couple of policy issues that are what I call sleeper issues or maybe under the radar in comparison to health and education. Fourthly, moving to more of the discipline side, shifts in paradigms that have governed both the way in which we make policy, but also how we think about policy. And then fifthly, some of the implications for our theoretical approaches and our explanations of policy dynamics. So let me begin first with the role of the state, which already has been touched on to some extent. The role of the state first in terms of global policy systems. This should be the world's global, or should have been, you might have anticipated it to be the world's global moment. It's a global pandemic. It's something that's spread around the world, as we all know. And because of its nature as a public bad, if you will, you would have anticipated that this would require and invite extensive international and global coordination and heighten the role of international organizations, as of course it did in the case of the WHO and even to some modest extent the UN. But in fact, what we saw was, as a function of necessity, that the first responses to the pandemic had to be national. They had to be subnational in many cases, and they continue to be local and regional. So even though this was a global pandemic, the policy tools at the disposal of policymakers were tools that were really only effective at the national level or the subnational level. And so as a result of that, we've seen a continued focus on national sovereignty, on national reactions, on national issues. And that's been exacerbated, of course, by at least some rising anti-China sentiment and a sense of competition, global competition between the United States and China in particular, with the outgoing president, Mr. Trump, and some of the actions that he's continuing to take vis-a-vis China, and some of the actions that Chinese authorities have undertaken geopolitically in the shadow of the pandemic, possibly taking advantage of the fractured attention that the United States and other powers currently have because of the pandemic. And all wrapped up in that is a kind of rising economic nationalism, partly due to, again, this anti-China sentiment, some of the lingering effects, I think, of the populist movements over the last decade, of which Mr. Trump was one example, perhaps an extreme example. But you see it even in some of the slogans of the incoming president, Joe Biden, talking about not using the same language of making America great, but or America first, but essentially emphasizing the importance of rebuilding and restructuring the American economy. So despite that, of course, there will be continued attempts to reassert global priorities, and climate change is the most obvious of those pressing priorities. So what I see is in the last year, a diminution or an overshadowing of global policymaking systems that we kind of took for granted in the last decade or so. And I'll come back to this in talking about changing paradigms. So a reassertion of national authority, national sovereignty, again, consistent with some of the developments around populism over the last decade, as I mentioned. With the post-pandemic situation possibly arriving in 2021, there will be an attempt, I think, to reassert the importance of global policy institutions, and some of that was already reflected in the foreign policy agenda of the Biden government, but incoming government. But there nonetheless will be attention and some re-examination, I think, of the balance or the rebalancing between national sovereignty, national priorities, the role of national governments, and the impact of global policy systems. So this suggests a reconfiguration of the national state, and this has already been alluded to by my distinguished colleagues in the opening remarks to the conference. Nationalism is possibly back. There even has been a term that was floated around in mid-year, Corona nationalism, where the countries were almost comparing themselves to each other in terms of the efficacy of their responses to the pandemic, feeling good about themselves if they were doing better, feeling badly about themselves if they were doing worse. Whether that'll last or not is an open question, but it did suggest that there was, again, because of the national focus and the need for a national reaction, the focus of national citizens tended to be on their own national capacities and their own national government. A second aspect of this reconfigured national state may very well be this combination. This is somewhat evocative, but an iron fist of securitization and containment. Think about border controls, immigration, contact tracing, record keeping, tracking, all within a pastoral glove of care, support, safety considerations, which is the next bullet there, a kind of rise of, which has been noted earlier, pre-pandemic, within contemporary Western states, of a kind of soft ideology of safetyism, a heightened concern about not just health safety, but safe environments, safe urban environments, safe playgrounds, safe contacts. So this notion of safetyism, as Ansel calls it in a book in 2019, may in fact again be magnified as a result of the impact of the pandemic. Will this lead to a more active state? There are certainly calls for that, and you see that right across the political spectrum, maybe not so much on the small c conservative side, but among more progressive elements and liberal and left-wing elements. This is seen as an opportunity, both for the rebuilding component of it, but also for the reassertion of national priorities, as I've already alluded to, and the need to deal with, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but I already prefigured that, some of the pre-existing conditions of inequality, of exclusion, of particularly disadvantaged subpopulations within different countries. So I can quote Mazzucato to this effect. She wrote recently in a column in the New York Times, and this is a quote: "The pandemic will require a rethink of what governments are for. Rather than simply fixing market failures when they arise, they should move towards more active shaping and creating markets that deliver sustainable and inclusive growth." So again, this is all part of the reassertion of national power and national responsibility to both manage the safety of populations, the health of populations, but also the economic prosperity and growth of their respective domestic economies. Now, there will be counter trends to some of this, particularly on the securitization and containment side of things. I think there may be simple fatigue. People will be tired of having to register their every movement, and once it's not necessary to trace contacts, people may simply delete the required apps. But as I mentioned before, policy initiatives tend to have a stickiness to them. And now that the security apparatuses and of most national states have played this heightened role during the pandemic, it's not likely that they're going to ratchet back completely 100%. So, but nonetheless, there will be a possibility of citizen fatigue with this kind of strong state. And there, of course, will be counter or pushbacks from civil libertarian organizations and others who are concerned about the expansion of state powers and state responsibilities. But for the time being, I think that's going to be sotto voce and eclipsed or overwhelmed by calls for the rebuilding and the reassertion of normalcy, which means a much more vigorous role for the state going forward. So those are some thoughts about the role of the state. In terms of policy fields, let me make a couple of points that may be somewhat obvious and maybe a little bit less obvious. Obviously, the prioritization of health policy and public health in particular is I think, one effect or result of the pandemic going forward. We may, in a year or two or three, develop some kind of policy amnesia, and once again, public health and public health protections and investments in vaccines and public health research may diminish. But for the time being, healthcare, the provision of healthcare through the various institutions, public health institutions, hospitals, etc., is an obvious priority in the conditions of the pandemic. But there are debates going on in different countries about their absent or diminished capacity, for example, to produce vaccines. This is a debate going on in my own country, in Canada, because we do not have the capacity domestically to produce vaccines, so we're completely dependent on importing the vaccines when they become available, as they are very shortly. So that, again, ties to the notion of state capacity and state responsibility and an increased role for the state in protecting its population. So healthcare, for obvious reasons, is going to be prioritized. I think a somewhat less obvious possible consequence or implication of the pandemic is the possible entanglement of public health considerations in other policy fields. Again, the policy people in the audience will be familiar with Wildavsky's notion of policy spaces. You know, we tend to think of policy in terms of healthcare, immigration, transportation, fiscal policy, education. So we tend to think of these as relatively delimited spaces. Obviously, in the real world, they interact and they overlap, more like Venn diagrams. So where it gets interesting is where you begin to see those overlaps becoming quite intensive or intense. And it may very well be that health and public health considerations are going to start getting entangled or mixed. The policy spaces may begin to overlap in areas, for example, like border control and immigration, or transportation, or even local and urban planning. So, so we may see the elevation and the intensification of public health considerations as part of policy conversations where they might not typically have occurred in the past. And that leads to another possible implication, and that's about policy advisory systems, an area that I'm currently interested in and doing some research on. Advisory systems, of course, mean that, or imply the kinds of institutions that channel different kinds of evidence and advice to policy and decision makers. We're used to the idea that a decision maker, a policy, let's say a political decision maker, will have to sit at a table these days, obviously with a finance person. They need to know the fiscal implications. They'll have to have a communications expert or advisor. In many countries, they need a legal advisor for the legal implications of whatever policy options they're discussing or thinking about. It may very well be going forward, at least for a short period of time or a medium term, having a public health expert is going to be another person you're going to have at the table to think about the possible implications of whatever policy option you're considering in whatever policy field. It might be transportation, immigration, education, and you may have to think about the public health implications, even post-pandemic. So health policy may get reconfigured, prioritized, and entangled in ways that we haven't seen before. On the educational front, I don't think I need to belabor this point. Everyone's familiar, and we've all been suffering the consequences of the pandemic in terms of our own university context and university teaching, and also at the K-12 and high school. So one of the debates that I have been following to some degree is the debates about what this may mean in terms of homeschooling, remote schooling, and education going forward. Parents obviously have had to juggle having their children at home and learning remotely, but it may have been an eye-opener in terms of the possibilities that are available in terms of some kind of mixed learning environment. So it's an open question whether after the pandemic everyone will simply go back to normal and kids will just simply be going back to school in the normal way, or whether there'll be some new kinds of debates or new kinds of thinking about the permutations and combinations of remote learning and delivery and the typical classroom instruction. So that's, and I've just, this is a pure anecdote, but I've even heard from some parents expressing amazement at how much their children seem to be learning in relatively short spaces of time at home, and they're scratching their heads and wondering what the kids have been doing all day when they've been going to school. So there's some of that kind of emergent skepticism, perhaps, about the conventional models of educational delivery that we've had in the past. And for university education, again, everyone in this audience knows the potential impacts, again, raising the same kinds of questions about modes of delivery and education. As everyone knows, in this sector, there's been a long-standing debate about the death of universities, the rise of online teaching, and the potential implications that would have for traditional configurations of university education. But the pandemic may have driven that home, again, fairly dramatically. And where it may have the clearest and most, at least for the medium term impact, most severe impact, is in terms of international students and their movements around the world. There are many countries and institutions that depend quite extensively on international students and their international student fees. Australia is a case in point with their reliance on Asian students to come as foreign students to their educational institutions. And that's a huge infusion of resources into the Australian post-secondary educational system. So there's some pretty extensive debates going on there now. And this would be true of any university or any set of post-secondary institutions that have a substantial reliance on international students. Will that continue? Will the flow of international students globally continue in the way that it did pre-pandemic, post-pandemic? If you combine this with the earlier points I was making about securitization, border control, public health considerations, skepticism about global institutions, a certain rising skepticism about, and I'll mention this in a moment, the pre-existing neoliberal model of a global system, it wouldn't be unusual to expect that there may be a diminished circulation of international students around the world, and that will have implications for post-secondary education in a lot of countries. So that's some thoughts about policy fields, the obvious ones, health and education. What about a couple of sleeper issues, or ones that are not entirely front and center on the policy radar at the moment? Fiscal pressures. Obviously over the last year, many, if not most countries have had to, in order to sustain their domestic economies, inject them with massive amounts of resources through economic stimulus, supporting the unemployed, helping people who have been having to work remotely or have lost their jobs, etc. So again, the configuration is different in different regions, in different countries. And I know we're going to have some papers, and if I may put a plug in, my own colleagues from the college have done work on a MENA tracker, trying to track policy responses in the economic, health, and social areas, social protection areas. And despite being in the same region, countries' reactions have been quite distinct and quite different. But nonetheless, generally speaking, countries have had to step up. In the American case, I think the last number I saw for the previous stimulus was close to $1 trillion. So that was 908 billion. But once you're at that level, what's a few more billion? So we can round it off to $1 trillion. Again, if I may speak of my own country, Canada, people pre-pandemic were wringing their hands at the federal government deficit of 24 billion, I think it was. This was an annual deficit. This was pre-pandemic, and people were worried, and some people were very worried that this was excessive and unsustainable. The last fiscal update from the Canadian government, which was just a few weeks ago, indicated that the deficit was running to $380 billion. So the magnitude of expenditures is very substantial. So the one question is, and this will touch on again when I get to the next slide about paradigms. Does it matter anymore? Does hand-wringing, is it justified, or does it make any sense in a context where this kind of stimulus seemed to be both necessary at the time in order to deal with the pandemic, and going forward, again, the slogan that's been adopted by many policy actors has been rebuild better. So the stimulus was necessary as an emergency intervention, an emergency measure, but there's a good deal of policy thinking that this should continue, but perhaps in a modified form. Paul Krugman last week in the New York Times had a column. Now, Mr. Krugman, Nobel laureate, and is well known for supporting more interventionist and state-directed economic policy making. But nonetheless, he had an op-ed piece in the New York Times titled "Learn to Stop Worrying and Love Debt," and then, if I may quote again from this article. He said, Joe Biden has promised to build back better, a slogan that translates into proposals to spend big sums on infrastructure, climate policy, education, and more, largely with borrowed money. And that's very much the right thing to do. Business may see only limited returns to investment, but we're in desperate need of more public investment, broadly defined, for example, including spending on children. Now, again, this is an American economist in an American newspaper talking about American circumstances. So we need to be a little careful, particularly as it applies to our region here. But nonetheless, if it's a straw in the wind, it suggests that not only has the fiscal terrain changed with respect to the pandemic and emergency spending, but the fiscal terrain may change quite dramatically going forward for many Western countries, at least. And from a policy point of view, it's a very interesting possibility, because the basic assumption, I think, in a lot of policy thinking is that there have to be trade-offs. You can't do everything simultaneously because you don't have the resources to do it. But if we are in a situation where, as Mr. Krugman says, proposals to spend big money on infrastructure, climate policy, education, and more, largely on borrowed money, and that's the right thing to do, it changes the debate, and it certainly lowers the credibility of arguments in favor of trade-offs and resource constraints, because it's not a matter of having the money. You can just borrow it and do what's needed to be done from whatever your perspective might be. So fiscal pressures may also translate into fiscal opportunities, but we'll see where that takes us over the next year or so. But it's more than just, the key point I'm trying to make here is it's more than just about spending money in an emergency context. It's changing the paradigm and the way we think about resource allocation that I think is important here. Social discontent, and this, of course, is not so much a policy issue as a policy context, but we certainly saw this over the last number of months. And again, the US, I'll come back to this, the US is perhaps the harbinger of this. But what we saw during the pandemic was a very potent and combustible mix of identity politics, whatever the largely driven around race, but in different countries it had a different component or different element to it. In my own country, again, Canada, with an Indigenous population, it wasn't just about people of color, but also about Indigenous people. So the identity politics in the Canadian context was also leavened by this other dimension of excluded populations in the Indigenous groups. So identity politics plus wealth disparity, extreme wealth disparity, which is not a function of the pandemic, but is a legacy perhaps of the last 10 years of neoliberalism. This would be the argument. Plus and combined with a sense of exclusion based on identity and based on wealth. So this is a very potent and, as I said, combustible mix that had different incidents and different impact in different countries. But it was remarkable how, to take the example of George Floyd, and I'll come back to this in the next slide, remarkable how an event, a tragedy like the George Floyd episode went viral globally. And you had protests right around the world around identity politics, wealth disparities, exclusion, racism, that were ignited by this event. So the social discontent is something that obviously simmers all the time, but seems to have been galvanized and accelerated by the pandemic. Whether it goes away or will diminish or be muted is an open question. I don't frankly know. Maybe it's something we could have for discussion, but it may very well be that the pandemic amplified and irritated those pre-existing conditions, and as a result, they will continue to have this element of amplification in going forward. Paradigm shifts. I've already to some extent alluded to potential paradigm shifts, but let me come back to them and maybe from a slightly different angle. One of them is the role of the United States as a model for policy transfer. We heard about wanting that taking governance models and scholarship from the West as taken for granted in the previous years, and it's time for this region to come to the table, to the high table, all of which I fully support. But of course, the implication is that the West and faute de mieux, it's the United States has been a model of sorts for policy transfer. Again, another area that I'm interested in is the flow and circulation of best practices, of models of governance, of models of policymaking, et cetera, around the world. The OECD is a perfect example of an organization that's dedicated to trying to facilitate and support the spread of best practices in the area of anti-corruption, for example, or fiscal policymaking, et cetera. So one of the things that's quite interesting about what's happened over the period of the pandemic, again, it was referred to in the opening remarks, is that the United States, regrettably, has seemed to have had a very sad short history in the last year or so of trying to deal with the pandemic. And I won't go into the detail, everybody knows about that. But what's remarkable is that it would seem difficult to take the United States as a role model any longer, at least in some selected areas. And again, this is a matter of debate, and incoming President Biden may resuscitate and revive and reestablish the stature and the visibility and the legitimacy of the United States over the next year or so. I'm not debating that, but at least for the moment, I think most people would be somewhat skeptical about the notion, for example, of the United States as a role model for democratic practices or elections. And indeed, instead of a role model, in many respects, it seems to be a fire starter or an accelerant on issues. And I already mentioned the George Floyd case. So partly because the United States has had historically this leadership role, this prominence in economics and politics and geopolitics and security and military role, and of course its role in international institutions, precisely because it's had that prominence and visibility and leadership, it tends to be a magnet for attention. And again, unfortunately, in the last year or so, it's been riven with a number of problems and challenges and missteps, and that focus of attention has been on all of these problems. So the things that people now pay attention to in the United States are on the negative side, the deficit side, if you will. So George Floyd is an example of that. So the racial issues in the U.S., which are particular and specific, historically unique to the U.S., end up being a lightning rod and an accelerant, if I can mix my metaphors, for racial debates and divisions around the world. Inequality, which again has a unique configuration in the United States because of its nature and because of the attention that's paid to it in the US and then consequently internationally, again becomes a lightning rod and an accelerant for debates about inequality around the world. So this is a difference in the role of the United States historically, over at least since the 1990s. Again, Mr. Biden may resuscitate the leadership role and the more positive image of the US, but for the time being, it's an interesting change in the terrain of global policy transfer and the role of the US particularly. And again, so even with renewed US leadership, there will continue to be a fragmented international system. And so it's not entirely clear what role the U.S. will play as a policy leader or as a model for policy transfer going forward. So that's a major potential paradigm shift in our thinking about international politics and policy transfer. The end of the millennial paradigm, this is a term that's been coined by our colleague Alistair Roberts, an American student of public administration, in a recent article. He refers to the millennial paradigm as this mix of neoliberalism, a relatively light-handed state, relatively light regulation, relatively free markets, a relatively constrained welfare state and social protection state. So this all comes under the umbrella of neoliberalism. I was listening to a podcast interview recently with one of the representatives of a think tank in the United States, the Roosevelt Institute, which has actually supposed this as well as the end of the neoliberal paradigm. So this reflects back to the earlier slide that I had about the role of the state and the increasing role of the state. What Roberts refers to as a potentially emerging new paradigm of more extensive social protection, which I already referred to, this kind of notion of safetyism, of a posture of policymaking in the state, that it's there to have its initial and one of its key roles is to protect its citizens, and that could be interpreted in a variety of different vectors or sectors, but it could be around border controls and immigration, it could be around security, it could be around information, it could be around health. But if you add all of those up, it has a very different kind of posture as a state from one that is, for example, largely redistributive in terms of providing checks or income support. So it's a different frame. And then again, the closer integration of states and markets, which I already referred to in the quote from Mazzucato. So this new emerging paradigm is one that I alluded to before in terms of the new potential role of the state and the end of this millennial paradigm or neoliberal paradigm that we had or enjoyed or suffered under pre-COVID. Again, it all depends on the mix going forward post-pandemic, but we may be on the cusp of a very different kind of governance regime or governance paradigm in the next few years. On theoretical approaches to the policy sciences, I want to touch on 4 potential implications for how we think about policymaking and public policy. The first is decision-making theory, or how we theorize decision-making. You all know about rational models and incrementalism and all the rest of it, so I don't need to belabor that. But 2 things have come up, I think, in some of the debates in the chapters of the book that I was referring to, and we're drawing on this, but also in some special issues of journals that came out in the last 6 months. For example, the importance of narratives in decision making, in how people postulate their circumstances and think through how they will get through their problems. If you think in terms of rational policymaking models, you think in terms of a problem, you think in terms of an option, you think in terms of solutions. What seems to have been reflected in decision-making, struggling with the pandemic and the crisis, is trying to develop a narrative that can be communicated to people about what their circumstances are, and to make sense. It's not solving problems; it's making sense in a collective way, and that making sense in decision-making relies on different ingredients than just evidence and hard calculation. It involves narratives, it involves emotive appeals, it involves emotional responses. So that aspect has been highlighted by some thinkers. How we calculate risk and how we assess risk is another aspect of this. The policy cycle, when you consider the impact and the effect of crisis decision-making in the context of the pandemic, does the policy cycle model, which is in every single textbook, including mine, I'm embarrassed to say, is the policy cycle model, does it even make any sense anymore when you think about how we had to respond to and stumble through and grasp at the options available to us in dealing with the pandemic? So decision-making theory and how we make decisions needs to be re-examined. The role of expertise in science. Now, of course, many people were calling for greater attention to experts, follow the evidence. But of course, one of the most riveting, for me anyway, aspects of the wrestling with the pandemic was the different advice that was coming from different experts. I mean, there is not any single expertise. Public health experts looking at evidence, at public health evidence, were often on the side of lockdowns and closures for public health reasons, for good public health reasons. Economists looking at economic data on unemployment and business closures were often on the side of more rapid reopenings because their expertise tended to induce them to focus on economic issues. So the role of expertise and science is really an open question. It's not a matter of following the evidence or listening to the experts, because the experts did not speak with one voice and the evidence did not inevitably lead to one conclusion. So how we think about expertise and science in policymaking also needs to be re-examined and revisited. Policy instruments, I'm getting close to the end of my time and I want to leave a little time for discussion, but policy instruments, the usual panoply, of course, has things like fiscal instruments and regulation and information and the rest of it. I think what we're going to have to rethink is new frontiers of policy interventions that involve controlling and monitoring populations. Again, we've taken it all for granted that we can have an app on our phone that is integrated and linked to our personal public health information that can then also signal to us if we're in the vicinity of someone who's had a COVID test and all the rest of it that most of you are familiar with. That's an extraordinary intervention in public privacy. And again, some of the lockdowns are just historically unprecedented. We've taken them for granted because we had to. But the range of policy interventions and instruments and digital and information instruments that are available to governments now, and that we've seen, they've always been available, but they become more visible and obviously more exercised in a more muscular fashion during the pandemic. We will need to rethink how we categorize and classify policy instruments. And then service delivery. There's a special issue of the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis, which I'm the executive editor, as Dr. Arabia mentioned, that it's a special issue on frontline service delivery, on frontline bureaucrats, and how we think about their role, particularly in terms of public health, nurses, and support workers, people serving the elderly, the indigent, the vulnerable. These were elements and aspects of service delivery that don't receive a lot of attention typically. And how people responded on the front lines was quite remarkable in many countries and in many instances. And their responses were often based not on how much money they were getting. In fact, their rates of pay were very low in most instances, but they were acting out of altruism and a sense of public service. So how we think about frontline service delivery, frontline bureaucrats is going to have to change as well. And the special issue that will be coming out in early, if I can be allowed another plug, coming out in early 21, we'll look at COVID and frontline bureaucrats. So let me conclude then with 4 points. Everything I've said are observations that may apply more to Western-style democracies and welfare states and regimes. So and I'm acutely aware that these are very general remarks that cover a lot of different potential countries and areas and regions. So I think we need to think about whether any of these things that I've said make any sense and have any traction in the context of regimes like those here in the MENA region or in Asia for that matter. The circumstances in China or Indonesia or Australia or in Egypt or in Qatar are not completely, but substantially different from those in the United States or Western Europe. So we need to think about if anything that I've said makes some sense, then what kind of sense does it make in the context of different countries and different regions with different governance traditions? So I leave that as an open issue for discussion. Comparative policy research. Again, my journal, the journal that I'm the executive editor for, a journal of comparative policy analysis, not only do we have this one issue looking at frontline bureaucrats, but we've got a second issue that's doing comparative research on different country responses. And I mentioned the MENA tracker that my own colleagues here in the college have done. So how do we compare countries in terms of their policy reactions to COVID? So that, I think there's a huge potential here for comparative research, because we've got a single case, the pandemic, and a almost limitless variety of responses to try to understand and explain. Public management, I mentioned, the potential diminution of global policy regimes, but the connection between domestic public administration and transnational public administration, I think it's always been on the agenda, but I think its importance is heightened as a result of what we've seen in the pandemic, this necessary interaction between international organizations like the WHO and domestic public health experts and institutions. How do they connect and interact? And I think that issue will be even more important in our scholarly research going forward. And then finally, how do we teach all this? What implications does, if anything that I've said makes sense or has any traction or will in fact take place over the next year, 2 or 5 years, how do we need to renovate our thinking about how we teach policy and administration? How will this filter into what we do in the classroom? So thank you very much, and I look forward to, I think we have a few minutes, I hope anyway, for discussion and perhaps some criticism and challenge of what I've said. So thank you very much.
Thank you very, very, very much, Dr. Leslie, for this really extremely thoughtful, thought-provoking, insightful, and for sharing your insights actually, and reflection analysis about what's going on. So I see that the lockdown was beneficial for you. It was very fruitful in terms of thinking and analyzing. There was like less disturbance with social distancing. So really, you provide, or your talk provides excellent research avenues. You covered and you highlighted very important policy issues. And all of us, we know that public policy, it's all about this, is to identify real policy issues and real problems, try to come up with realistic and realistic solutions. So throughout the semesters, we were teaching this semester, we're asking students to come up with to write policy briefs or to write some policy papers. And I was amazed that none of them came with something related to Corona. As if they were completely disconnected, all we're talking about, issues that, as I mentioned, before Corona, the BC, it's still not there, they're still living in the era before the pandemic, before COVID.
Oh, interesting.
So it's very important to highlight this, and to bring them to this reality. Maybe there's this denial still, that we don't want to really face the reality, that we still have to deal with things that from before the pandemic, because most of the students, like, they're from Lebanon, from Sudan, from Egypt, so they were mainly dealing with the electricity, a cut of electricity from the internet, so they're still not perceiving these challenges that you pinpoint to and you highlighted, which essentially, in terms of the need for theoretical, to revisit the theories. I was very glad, very happy that you talked about the rational decision-making theory and the evidence-based, because I think our field is mainly based on this, evidence-based and cost-benefit analysis and rational and the policy cycle. So I think there is a reality that is catching up. So try to use, I liked the making sense of the reality, and use more narrative and emotional versus rational So thank you very much, Dr. Leslie Paul. Now I open the floor for questions.
I don't know how you want to proceed, Dr. Rabia. There's one question. I can see something in chat. During the pandemic situation, do you want me to respond to chat? Or do you...
Yeah, please go ahead. Actually, we have two. We have one from Dr. Nizar, because we have two parts, right?
Okay. I see. Yeah.
Regarding fiscal stimulus.
Oh, I see them, right, yeah. So what's the priority on policymaker making public health, national security, protecting jobs? Security of jobs is also an impact on national security. Priority of a policymaker. Okay, same question, I think, yeah. What's the priority? Well, I think going forward now that the vaccine seems to be on the cusp of being distributed in different countries. I think in many countries it may be available. It's already available in the UK. It may be available in some countries at least before the end of the month. And then I think even in Qatar, it's possible that within a few weeks. I saw a newspaper article yesterday to this effect. Once a vaccine is provided, I think there'll be a shift from public health considerations, though, as I mentioned, I think they'll continue to be entangled in other policy issues, to rebuilding. And again, this will vary depending on the economic impact in different countries. Some countries have done relatively well, or their economies are continuing to do reasonably well. And most of the international economic organizations like the IMF and the OECD and the World Bank are projecting, and most of the private banks as well, are projecting very substantial renewed economic activity in 2021. So I think the shift in focus will be on toward the economic side, re-employment, getting people back to work. But again, in different countries, that will open a debate about what the role of the state is in terms of stimulating certain areas like green technologies or moving away from carbon-intensive manufacturing into something different.
Here's a question from Dr. Nizar. Regarding fiscal stimulus, do you think that fiscal spending during this phase of uncertainty will stimulate investment, or it only will end up with massive debt?
Well, I'm not an economist. I think it's definitely going to end up with massive debt. Just because of the logic of printing money and spending it. As I said, my sense of the economic projections for 2021 is that they're going to do okay, that the economies are going to revive. So, but at the same time, every time there's a hiccup and what appears to be a potential for a downturn, the markets react quite negatively. So I think there's a dynamic now where markets are very skittish and governments recognize that, and so they're doing all they can over the next year to try to calm the markets, and the way to do that is with low interest rates and extensive infusions of cash and stimulus. So I think 2021, from what I can tell from the projections, is going to be a good year economically. Whether that will be necessarily the result of spending is not clear. But it is necessary for governments to spend, because otherwise they will affect the psychology of markets. So it's a little circular that way, I think.
Dr. Hamid? Okay, I have, by the time Dr. Hamid asks question, Dr. Ilyas Khalil. Okay. COVID-19 might be the milestone of the end of the neoliberalism, but the signs were obvious with the influx of refugees into Europe and US. But there has been always refugees. Do you have insights on the real causes of the demise of neoliberalism?
That's a big question.
It's from an economist, by the way. But he's a philosopher.
Yes, yes.
So he's an economist, philosopher.
Well, in a very short way, and I say this with some humility because it's a big question and would require a much more extensive answer. But I think one potential factor undermining the neoliberal paradigm, if we consider neoliberalism as being, again, what do I mean by neoliberalism? Relatively light state intervention, let markets more or less operate, a globalized context with free flow of people and capital. So let's put those two on the table as what I define neoliberalism as. Why would it be undermined? The effects appear of this relatively open market system, effects in terms of inequality. We've seen rising inequality over the last decade, very substantial. The people who've done well have done very well. The people who've done not so well have done, very badly. The deindustrialization and hollowing out of, in the American context, in North America and some other countries. So the evidence of the benefits of neoliberal economic policies is questionable. And the second dimension is, as was mentioned, refugees and immigration. In the European context, the challenge to neoliberalism in its populist guise came in large part not because of economic hollowing out, which was more the American version of populism, the Trump make America great again, rebuild the industrial heartland, get the coal mines going again. In the European context, populism was animated more by anti-refugee sentiment and the apparent borderless world. And so I think that was a pillar of neoliberalism in the European context that was fractured or shaken. So you put those two together, and the neoliberal model in the West, I think, was challenged on those two grounds at least.
Okay, again from Dr. Nizar, what implications COVID will have on reforms in the MENA region or MENA countries? That's another talk.
I don't know. I mean, here, let's talk about Qatar. I think here it may very well be that the impact will be relatively minimal. I think once we get the vaccine, it's a small population, it's a small country. It's dependent on natural gas resources, every exports, as everybody knows. If the global economy bounces back next year, as it should, then the Qatari economy will do quite well. We've got FIFA coming in 2 years, in 2022, and all of the infrastructure is being constructed and built for that. So it may very well be that, in the Qatari case, for the domestic government policy framework, the impact will be relatively minimal. I can't speak for other countries. I wouldn't even pretend to. Maybe this is something that people can continue to discuss over the next 2 days. And I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this.
There is Hussein Awadat, one of our graduates. So maybe it's related to this question, the reaction or the response of probably he's talking about Qatar, to the response to Corona crisis in terms of health, because he's working at Hamad. So you mentioned in terms of paradigm shifting, the issues, especially the healthcare. So do you think that something will be changed, that there was like a move toward a different paradigm shift in the healthcare in Qatar?
Well, I'm not so sure about Qatar, but I think generally speaking, as I mentioned, it seems to me that health considerations and public health considerations are going to become part of many different policy conversations. So social distancing and then the possibility of and the necessity of creating spaces where people can have space between them may become part of urban planning discussions, for example. In education, at least in K-12, keeping children in safe circumstances from a health perspective, hygiene, hand washing. So I think those things are going to begin to get woven into everyday management and the running of institutions. So to that extent, I think that set of health considerations is going to be projected and injected into a range of different policy considerations and policy debates that we haven't seen them in before.
Mm-hmm. So more health awareness. Dr. Hamid, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul, for that very fruitful, and it's almost frontiers of the public policy where we're supposed to push it further, and that conversation is going to be continued for a while. The one thing that is just striking me about the model of the policy transfer and the U.S. The U.S. has never been a model for the policy transfer, rather than it was operating through the global system that is just imposing some ideas that sometimes has no roots, and contrary, it end up distorting the reality, particularly if you look at the MENA region. So given the new trend with the fragmenting the international system and the demise of the US influence because of this, because US will never be back as it was. And this was opening up a new frontier that is, people need, probably in this region, we need to think quite independent and try to develop our own policy rather than looking for the international system values that try to impose. One thing that I'm just in my question regarding about the policy science. Of course, there is so much debate about policy science, public policy, and the role of the policy expert, and etc. But for our students, and this is one of the things that I'm just thinking in terms of our school here, data analytics, artificial intelligence, and the machine learning. These are going to be very critical skills that we're supposed to give it to our students today, in today's world. Because the public policy schools are running away from these skills. And I think probably any reflection on that ones to have programs on the data analytics, artificial intelligence, and the machine learning.
Yeah, there's the OECD has a division or an entity called the Observatory for Public Sector Innovation. And they, during the COVID period, the pandemic period over the last year, the observatory, again, I'll mention it, Observatory for Public Sector Innovation for people that are interested. Countries can voluntarily submit what they consider to be a policy innovation in their own context. So it's a bit responsive, not directive. But they have something like, the last time I checked, over 480, almost 500 cases that have been registered as policy innovations or public management innovations from different countries right around the world. They're not just OECD members. And Dr. Hamid is absolutely right. The majority of those submitted, those innovations are using digital platforms, artificial intelligence, social media, web-based applications, etc. So I think you're absolutely right that the frontier, one of the frontiers of public management and policymaking in the next decade, in the next 5 years, is going to be, it already is digital transformation. We need to do a better job teaching that and equipping our students to at least understand that technology. So I agree with you, and I think what that may suggest is partnerships with our respective colleagues in engineering colleges or schools, or in the IT sectors that are working on artificial intelligence, and we need to be able to translate, the more technical side of that into what it means for policy applications and policy tools. I have colleagues in Canada and at Oxford who are working on a network to develop, better curricula for teaching digital technologies and digital governance. So it's happening, and but you're absolutely right. We need to pay attention to that because it's a major change in how we teach.
Again, I think it depends on each country and the infrastructure, because as you just mentioned, there are some countries that are still struggling with the access to electricity and internet. So if that also case by
yeah, of course, yeah, it varies in context.
So the last two questions for so first from I haven't seen this because they're using two types of chat rooms. Okay, very well. Yeah. So from Daryl Jarvis, how is policy science able to confront what appears to be the rise of science and expert skepticism as populist movements increasingly marginalize evidence-based policy and the role of experts in political decision-making?
So how to deal with the skepticism of experts?
Yes.
Yeah. I think one of the things that has to be done is some honesty about the differences among experts. Again, it was a matter of some frustration to me to see politicians or critics saying, well, we just need to follow the evidence, or we just need to listen to the experts, or we need to do what the scientists are telling us, without any acknowledgement whatsoever that there are different perspectives coming from different disciplines. So I think one way forward is to be honest about the different perspectives that different experts bring to an issue, and to find ways of honestly addressing the fact that trade-offs have to be made, and that ultimately values are also part and parcel of a decision-making process. It's not just evidence. The evidence doesn't speak for itself. That's tough, but I think it's very important to acknowledge that, so that we don't go down the road, because the obvious implication is that of a very substantial diminution of democratic input. If we're just listening to experts, then why do we need politicians, and why do we need public consultation, and why do we need to have public debates about things? We simply need to check the evidence and talk to the experts, and that's the end of it. So I think some kind of honest honest confrontation with and explanation of the balancing that needs to be done among different forms of expertise and different forms of evidence is an important ingredient in going forward on that.
Thank you. So last question from Dr. Ali Mistarihi. It's about the role of the state. So I think you mentioned this. Would you please elaborate more on the anticipated role of the state?
Well, as I said, I think one strong possibility for states, well, generally, but again, this will vary region by region, is for a more muscular, a more robust, a more active state. In what ways? Economically, the calls again to build better, to rebuild, to build anew. So we may see, and it's certainly being encouraged by different actors. And the American, here's where I may contradict myself. I mean, if Mr. Biden becomes, as he will, becomes president, and in the next year leads an attempt at massive stimulus in areas like green ecology and climate change and all the rest of it, the U.S. may become a kind of role model for that kind of economically interventionist state. So on the economic side, we'll see stimulus, not just in terms of spending money, but also possibly in picking winners and deliberately and actively stimulating certain key sectors like electric cars or green technologies. So that's on the economic front. On the social front, we may, again, if this ideology or a paradigm of safetyism becomes more widespread, to cite our colleague Alistair Roberts, then the role of the state will become more protective, not just in health, but across the spectrum. So the state will have more of a protective stance than it has before. So that's economic and social, and then finally, in terms of security and securitization and public safety in the broader sense of the term. Again, the pandemic may be sticky in that sense, in that it may leave a legacy, a lingering legacy of much more intensive controls and security measures and tracing and registering and monitoring than we've seen before, and which we may simply take for granted. So on both the economic, social, and security fronts, we may see a reconfigured role for the state generally, but again, that will vary country by country, tradition by tradition, region by region.
So we're going towards polity, right? To imply public policy. So thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Paul. We'd like to thank all the attendees, all the participants for being here. Again, we would have loved to have you, to see you face to face and welcome you here. So we stop here. We resume at 11 exactly for the morning sessions. We have, I think, 5 sessions in parallel sessions in Arabic and in English. So please feel free to attend whatever session, depending on the topic you're interested to. And then we finish at 1, and we will have a break for 1 hour, and we resume at 2 o'clock with the second keynote speaker, Dr. Stephen Hertog. And then we will have the evening or afternoon sessions till 5. I think till 5 p.m. So thank you very much for being here, and see you later. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hamid. Thank you, Dr. Abdel Wahab. Thank you, Dr. Pa. Thank you, Muhammad, Anas, and